Hello and welcome to Spitfire Presents. I'm Robert Kraft. And Spitfire Presents is a new series featuring the world's best composers of film, television, and video games. No question, we have the best because we have John Powell today, one of the world's most illustrious composers, my great friend. Yes, yes, it's true. You're going to hear all this, JP. And you're going to also, I'm going to brag about the fact that you've just been shortlisted for this unbelievable achievement, which we're going to talk about today, of scoring Wicked, which I think has made several $billion in this universe and many others. And I think you're on your way to getting that tuxedo on and getting a little speech prepared on March 2nd. So I want to hear what remarks you have already thought of and kind of funny jokes to say, shucks, I wouldn't be here without. You also have two other motion pictures currently in the marketplace, as if Wicked wasn't enough. Thelma the Unicorn and That Christmas. So you've been busy. And before we start, I'm just going to brag a little bit about some of the shows that you have worked on that I have loved. First of all, of course, all the Bourne movies, Bourne Identity, the coolest cue ever that everyone has ripped off forever. And it's now in like Cadillac commercials. You hear the Bourne Identity kind of sideways cue. Of course, Shrek, Ice Age, Kung Fu Panda, X-Men, United 93, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Italian Job, Green Zone, and an Academy Award nomination for a show we're going to talk about, How to Train Your Dragon. 3 Grammy noms, Solo, A Star Wars Story, Concert Works, Don't Worry, Darling, the controversial, wonderful film. Welcome, Maestro John Powell. It's nice to see you. I think I'm exhausted just from thinking about all the work you've done. But JP, on this wonderful day, I want to ask you about the monstrous, massive, and epic achievement of Wicked. I saw it. I could not believe the amount of music. I mean, I was kind of amazed by how it was wall to wall, and that was only part one. So, I mean, you have more to write, but I want to ask first about just the collaboration, because the score is credited to you and Stephen Schwartz, who of course wrote the songs. I expect you always to be diplomatic, but had Stephen Schwartz ever scored a film before?
That's a good question. I don't know, but if you want to talk about musicians and composers who are at the top of their game of being able to tell stories with music, you couldn't get anybody better than Stephen Schwartz. And I think that's what all film composers are supposed to be as well. So, it took days and days of sort of early meetings with Stephen, trying to sort of unpack exactly how I wanted to know exactly how he wrote, the musical the first time, and I also wanted to know how he constructed everything in the original underscore, as it were, for the musical. On stage it has to be a lot more efficient, but it was incredibly detailed and beautifully constructed, and it's a very operatic sort of structure thematically in the first place. So I knew I had that to begin with. Stephen understands the story better than anybody, but my job was to sort of reinterpret that into what John wanted to make, which was this new thing, a film, a cinematic version of the story that he'd seen when he was 20 or 21 in San Francisco, even before it got to Broadway. And I think created such a love of cinematic storytelling that he saw on stage before he perhaps even, I think he hadn't really worked out that he wanted to be a filmmaker at that point, and really, I think it solidified his vision. So, yeah, there's a whole mixture of things. It probably, to say that I couldn't do this until I was 60 probably is true. It just required an awful lot of different sort of, processes to figure out how to do this. Because, when you start it, you don't know how it's going to work. I mean, John, I think, had a vision of how it was going to feel to him, but the details of that are really hard to sort of express, I think. So I think he cast me very carefully.
Tell me, I'm curious, how did John Powell, I mean, of course, in retrospect, and there's a lot of looking at Wicked that it is in retrospect, you have to reverse engineer how this came together, but was there a John Powell, can you come to John Chu's house, office, studio, and have a conversation? Do you know Stephen Schwartz, and do you know Wicked? What was that process?
Yeah, well, it was Mike Knobloch, who I met working with you at Fox, and is now runs music at Universal, calling me up. And the interesting thing is, it wasn't so much about me; it was about one other person's reaction. So I'm on the phone with him, and he's saying, "Look, we're doing this musical, Wicked, and it's really going to be good. And I was wondering if you'd be interested." And I'm sort of on the phone, and Holly's there, and I said to Holly, "It's Wicked," sort of things like this, and her face just kind of went like this, and I realized, this is something that I should really be very, very careful about thinking how I think about this, because I hadn't seen it. And it turns out that there's only about two of us in the production. One was the other screenwriter, Dana Fox, and me hadn't seen it, and I had to sort of say that to John. So I was in London recording, I think it was Migration, just finished Migration, and he was there shooting. So I popped over to see him, and we had a lovely conversation. And I thought, geez, this kid's smart, I thought. And then I went to see Stephen when I was back in LA. He was there, and I had to admit to him, and I knew him. The very first thing I did in LA was work on songs on Prince of Egypt with Hans, and he was lovely then, and I loved his songs then. And I'd seen him over the years, but I hadn't worked with him. I mean, he'd gone off and done this other thing, which was Wicked and the other thing. But so then so once I'd got through Mike, who Holly's face sort of told me an awful lot about perhaps the importance of this, and then I got to John, then I got through Stephen, then I had to get to Mark Platt, who was the producer of the original, and he was the one that kind of gave me the hardest time, which was good. I think he gave me a much more realistic picture of how complicated this might be.
Tell me what a hard time sounds like, just because a lot of folks want to know, wait, you're John Powell, don't you just walk into the room and they bow down and say, whatever you want to do, we want you to do it? What would be even possibly a hard time from a movie producer? Quizzing you about, do you understand the story?
Yes, and also it's lovely that as somebody yourself who's been right inside this business, you're allowing this idea of the fantasy of composers having anything other than
Carte blanche.
Well, yeah, I mean, the idea that we'd have carte blanche is hysterically funny, but I mean, we're there to be cast correctly. So every interview you have is about, are you? I mean, your music at a certain point is taken. Your abilities are taken for granted. Technically, the style of what you do is obviously going to be a big factor as to whether or not you can walk in the room, whether they're interested in you. Your cost, the price of you, is a factor. But then when you get to the point at which you're talking to the producer and the producer's asking you questions, they're digging. They're digging to see if you, what kind of personality you might be. And the personality you have to be as a film composer is not somebody who walks into the room and expects carte blanche. I mean, it's a collaborative process. I mean, when I write my operas, it can be a little less collaborative. But in this particular case, it's actually a few years ago I started deciding very much. It's like, why would I do films? Because I'd done so well. I was lucky. I could calm it all down at a certain point. And it came down to a lot of the film choices I've done recently are, do I like the people, and can I be useful? Because there's a lot of really good composers out there who can do the stuff. So why would you bother getting me to do it? And I sort of sometimes have to think, it's like, well, there's 20 other people who could do this. It's like, what would be the point of me doing it? And in certain cases, it was just about the people. I mean, Migration was very much about Chris Meledandri and the director Benjamin, and and then the same with a couple of these Netflix films. They were very much and animation. I do love animation, and I love the people working in animation. But I think Wicked felt like, okay, I think there's a set of skills here that. Sorry, entrance of the poodles.
Nice, Elvis.
No, not Elvis. Moose is the oldest one, and then Marigold. So
thank you very much.
But it's like what this film could need is kind of complicated. I remember thinking to myself, and so that last conversation with Mark Platt was important, where Mark is sort of quizzing me on it. And asking, what, sort of the questions about the story. The great thing was, I before I saw the musical, as it were, I saw the films. I was very early. John let me see them. And I saw them with no music except for the songs. So it was, and they were about 3 hours, both 3 hours long. And so I would just hear nothing, sound effects, dialogue, and then people would break into song, and then they'd stop singing, and there would be no music again.
You just answered a big question for me, which is the reverse engineering aspect of when you entered. Those songs that you heard that had been shot, had they been shot to demos? Had they been shot to click tracks, to pianos, to full-on, this is a finished piece that you're just going to take the key and move your score afterwards in that key into a score cue? How did you, and what shape were those songs when you first heard it?
Everything, would you believe? I mean, they went through everything. They built a demo studio to record vocals and pre-records. They had an amazing kind of crew of music editors and arrangers, who Stephen had worked with, and obviously Stephen. And so as they shot, they adjusted what they were working with depending on almost every shot. I think some vocals, a lot of vocals were done live, and it is amazing. I mean, I've really heard these things, and and some are actually kind of the demo vocals, and some are redos and things, and you'll never know. I mean, it's amazing.
Seamless.
Sort of technical job, but as well, I mean, it's an extraordinary crew on sound on this film, and needed to be. But I, at that point, was hearing sometimes just piano and voice, and then sometimes a fully mocked up kind of version with. Greg Wells had done lots of these demos that sounded great, but they had some basic orchestration on it in demo form, and some just taken straight from the show orchestrations, and and a whole mixture of things, and it would change on each number. Some of them really sounded pretty rough, for the longest time, because everybody knew it all well enough that they didn't need it to sort of sound like it does now. But if you've not seen the musical, I mean, everything was there. It's not like I was missing anything, but certainly what worked, I think, in my advantage was my usual process, which is not having any music in there, so I can just think and let the story unfold. That also helps me understand any difficulties in the story and what the pacing as well of the movie is feeling like, and I think that you see the space in which you're going to have to work to help things, but also as those bare bones sometimes versions came in. I mean, seeing it be an exact sort of continuance of the storytelling always, which I think is down to Stephen Schwartz's abilities as a dramaturg. Those moments of it suddenly becoming song, were very, very clear and powerful. And obviously I knew it, my head would be sort of, when I watch something without music, and my head's sort of filling in gaps and trying to sort of feel the emotional level. But what you have right from the very beginning, when I saw it even in these rough forms, was such clear performances all the way through by the two leads, that every time they started singing, it felt like just a continuance of that. It never tripped up as people got to sing, and that is, I think that's been the difficulty for the modern audience with musicals. I mean, I happen to be a lover of lots of old musicals, perhaps. I was kind of brought up. I remember, people always say, "What's the first film score you remember hearing?" And I remember say West Side Story. Not really a film score.
Yeah.
So I took that as kind of the sort of pinnacle of when I was a kid watching that on TV, that's how film and that's how image and storytelling and music should go together. I think I've always kind of kept that close. So I'm hearing all this stuff, watching the performance, and I'm watching the story, and it's an amazing, thanks to the performances of the main two leads. I mean, the whole thing just flows on that. It's so convincing. And it was hard because I saw, I think, the first part one on a Tuesday, and I was trying to persuade the edit room to let me carry on and watch the other half, and they had to go home. So by that time it was like.
So you wanted to watch all 6 hours back to back?
Yeah, I did, yeah, because I got to the end of the first one. I was like, oh, yeah. I mean, I feel sorry for everybody that they're going to have to wait until November for part two, but I waited a few more days, and I came back a couple of days later and watched the rest of it.
So where did you see Mark Platt in the middle of all this? You said you'd seen it. So you'd seen both, and then you went to see him?
Yes. Yeah. So it was like John and Stephen, and then I saw the films, and then I saw Mark. And so, Mark was asking me various questions, and I think probably my reaction and my analysis of what the job was probably the difference between me being the right person or not.
Well, I'd love to be a fly on the wall and hear that, because you're gracing over the most difficult thing I could imagine, which is between the songs, it's not scored yet. And you're the person that's charged with imagining, well, what happens in the dramatic shit that's going on in between the songs, that you're saying, oh yeah, oh, I could tell what. That to me is this stupefying assignment that you inherited, which is I mean, I've been listening to the score, is magnificent work, but that didn't exist that first time you saw it. And how do you say to someone, I got this, I know what to do, and they trust you to do it? I mean, that's just, I don't want to leave behind the fact that you actually wrote the music in between the songs, which is incredible.
Well, it's hard to say exactly how I did it, because I didn't know at that point. I mean, part of being successful in this business is being able to walk into the room with the producer after having seen the films and describe what you think you could do. And I mean, it's very much about the story. So,
Did you describe what you could do in terms of story specifics? When Galinda walks into her room for the first time, I think it should be, or do you just say this kind of general emotional thing? I think it could bring an audience to a place where they understand. How do you have that language with the producer?
Well, in this particular case, I'd say, it's easier with other things because there's no songs in existence. There's no, 23-year history of the producer knowing every single note of the original. In this particular case, I mean, I'm hearing the songs. I mean, obviously, I'd heard Gravity and a couple of them probably for good and popular in the background of the world.
Yeah,
they were there, but I'd never really sort of noticed it. I think a couple of years earlier, I'd gone to something where a couple of people got up and performed for good, and they weren't the best singers. And I remember thinking, "Oh, what's this?" Stuff like that. I think for me, this Wicked is hopefully the best version that of the musical performances of the songs that I can imagine. I mean, obviously, I can't go back in time and listen to some of the amazing performances that have been done of it. I did eventually go and see the show in I think last December, a year ago, when I was just finishing up in London. I went just before I came back to LA.
That's funny.
And I was tired, and I went. John said, you should go. And I said, you sure you don't think I should just stay for everything? He goes, no, you just go. And so I went, and it was a sort of a matinee, Sunday afternoon matinee or something, and it's a great production, but I'm sure everyone was a bit tired. Let's put it that way. And I'd just seen what I thought was like the best version of this story. And then I go and watch it on stage, and it all kind of locked together a bit more. And one of the things was sitting there at the end and watching everyone just leap on their feet from a matinee afternoon tired, everybody's tired kind of thing, matinee, and it just you could see it landing, and I was tired, so I couldn't give it the emotional. I didn't get the emotional reaction I'd got watching the films, because of, I think, the circumstances, which is why you should always worry about how critics watch films. It's like, what if they have a bad day? What if they're tired? But it was really interesting, and this is one of the things I've learned very much from John, is watching the audience's reaction to it made me realise what an important thing it was, and the joy it had brought, the world already in this 20 years it had been out, and the millions of people had already seen it. And so it became very clear that, this was a job I could do, I would be useful, and so from then onwards, how do you do it? You just start.
Oh, it's funny how that's one sentence that you just said speaks volumes. How do you do it? You just start, because I think a lot of us think about the creative process as, oh God, where do I begin? And you just kind of very perfectly, you just get started. I mean, I think that one of the things that was amazing to me, among the many things that are amazing, is, and you mentioned in the beginning a little bit about the music editors, and is that there is this incredible flow from song production to score, and that sonically it doesn't feel like, oh, now we're in a different studio, now we're in a different room, oh, the song ended and something has changed. It just feels, the flow is incredible sonically. And I just wonder You know, it's like building a house and there are pieces put on, yet somebody has to kind of make it all feel like it's the same house at the end. Did you get involved in any of the song arranging because you knew that song ends and has to flow into a score bit? Did the song arrangers and you discuss what happens leading up to the song or coming out of the song? Because from an audience perspective, I sat there and thought, magnificent flow.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, it's not like, it didn't exist as a magnificently flowing thing already, in the sense that the musical was constructed in such an elegant way, with underscore, with Stephen Oremus and Alex Lacamoire and these incredible guys who put it together and made it all work that way. I think it came down to, I come in not knowing anything, and then on the first time through, I'm hearing the songs really for the first time, and I'm hearing the melodies, and my head sort of starts firing on the thing. So then I wanted to investigate how Stephen did it and what the language was, and try and learn the language, his harmonic language, his melodic language, his intention, the language of intent, as well as to why things did what they did. And so we spent 2 days together, Stephen and I basically kind of interrogated him. I interrogated the musical, and I interrogated every motivation.
Does he sit at a piano and you just look over his shoulder and see changes and melodies and that kind of thing?
Yeah, and we had sort of Bibles of kind of, we had the full score, then the vocal score, and then we had kind of like tunes and riffs and things, and what Stephen thought they meant, and then I would make parallel notes in that, because I was taking a story at face value of how I saw it on the screen rather than how it had been constructed. So I was constantly, I think, doing a compare and contrast against what I saw, how I felt about the story, how I felt about the characters, and what had been done. And I knew that, and I think that was part of my conversation with Mark Platt, is Mark Platt was worried probably that a composer would come in and be, well, I'm a film composer, I'm just going to, write what you need, which kind of was what John sort of wanted. He needed what he needed. And, he knew, obviously, the deep, the deep meaning behind a lot of the previous underscore, and I'd had that explained to me really very clearly by Stephen, and Mark is looking for somebody who's not going to mess that up, but also he was used to having more people who are just arrangers and stuff come in and do it as they would do for musicals, and so I think everyone was trying to get a sort of a sense of how much, including me, how much sort of agency I had,
Yeah,
and how much I should use, and what was wise. And we were all very open about it. And John is incredibly good at sort of negotiating everybody into the most sort of civil discussions about what's important, because these were babies. These were the babies of the producer and executive producer and the composer, and I'm coming in and John's trying to make a movie of what he saw probably when he was 20, and and Universal's trying to make something that they can have a success with in a genre that has been proving incredibly difficult to have success with recently. So all of these things, all these pressures were on, but I think John was the one who basically would sort of negotiate between all of us. It's like the importance of what the fans wanted, the importance on and I was very clear on this, is like what I see on the screen, what I see the lens doing, what I see the camera doing, what the language of cinema is saying to us. And I could say it to everybody. I could say it to John. I can say, look, this is what I'm seeing. So if this in other words, so if something from the musical is so important, it's like we have to find a way to still keep that, but
It's
do
easy to
it.
kind of arrive at, when I hear you say that, two conclusions. One is they're actually lucky to have somebody who hadn't seen it. It's an odd thing to arrive at as a conclusion, but that you're going to bring fresh ears, fresh eyes, a well, you're seeing things in this and have them say, God, we've taken that for granted for 20 years because we're so used to it. That's important. You're absolutely right. I mean, that's one thing I could imagine. The other is a really central role that the composer plays that I learned from our mutual friend Hans that I never knew until he once said, you know, I'm one of the filmmakers, is basically the way, he didn't say it that way, but that he said, you never want to defend your score like you're outside the process. You're working with everyone else. And when you say what you saw in the camera, in the lighting, in the dancing, affects you as a filmmaker and how you would musicalize that, that's the chair you have at the table. I think it's really fascinating. And film composers don't, certainly when they're starting out, they're just trying to figure out what the rhythm of the edit is and how do I put some cool beats on it, as opposed to what you're doing at with your experience is dollying back to say, what is the actual story? What is needed? And I don't think it's said enough. I do think that they got the right person for the reasons that you've graced over, which is you've had a lot of experience with musicals. I've been there with you on a number of them, Rio, Ice Age. In fact, I was thinking this morning, I can't remember which one it was. It might have been Robots, not necessarily a musical. Do I remember correctly that we visited the Blue Man Group to
Yeah,
bang on whatever those tubes were
yeah,
maybe in Brooklyn or in yes.
yes. I can't quite remember what it was. They had a very cool headquarters somewhere in New York, uh, and yeah, that was amazing. I mean, I just was digging through some photos today, and there we all are with three blue men doing a kind of a slightly staged recording with the orchestra in at Fox for that. Yeah,
Really? Did we?
yeah,
That my memory isn't. I remember being in that room, and I have a photo of you and me in the middle of those polymer tubes or whatever that stuff was. That they, if I'm not mistaken, with all due respect to the Blue Man Group, it didn't quite work out for the score of Robots, or we didn't use a lot of it. Maybe one cue.
but there was bits all over the place, really. I mean, yeah, we had a fun sort of day or two sort of playing with them, and I think we recorded them, and I got samples of things, and they were very generous about it, and I incorporated things that seemed to work and stuff, and then we did do some bits where they played over a few things as well, and so I think all of that. Yes, it was exactly the same sort of situation where we sort of deconstruct and then
Yeah.
reconstruct based on what the film needs, and a lot of it was incredibly useful and even inspiring. Even if we didn't use the details of it, sometimes you're inspired by it.
I want to ask a question about those demos and the MIDI and Logic. There's the very, just for the tech heads that are listening and are very curious about your process, the final credit of the credit roll, which I sat and watched every single credit, is sample libraries provided by Spitfire Audio, a truly wonderful credit for this podcast. When you are doing your demos to play, and was Steven aware, and did he approve, and did he like some of the samples, and are there any samples that you would use and then replace? What is the process and is it in Logic, and is it MIDI?
Yeah, it's all certainly MIDI. Stephen had, we kind of picked some sounds for him. He didn't want to get into the sort of programming up, orchestral library
Would you
sounds.
give him like Abbey Road Library or
Well,
Albion or?
it depends. I've gone back. I go back with Spitfire right to the very beginning. I was one of the, I don't know, it was about 20 of us or something like that that bought into their very first orchestral library, which was this
Wow.
private library that not many
That's
people
right.
had,
Yeah.
and it was kind of their first go through at it. And so I've been using their sounds, and I have a mixture. I have some sounds that I still use from that library, and all sorts of things all along the way. It depends on kind of how you're writing and what and difference. There's things about like one of their solo clarinets that are brilliant for certain things and not for other things. It depends how you're writing
Yeah.
on what you want to write, and they have their own preferences in it. They're both composers, so if you have a bunch of composers making sample libraries, they're going to go towards their preferences musically as well, and some of those are absolutely in sync with how I think, and some aren't. So I use a mixture of things from their various bits of the library. But to get that kind of, that's 25 years of messing around with this stuff. Well, I mean, for me, it's 35 years of kind of working with Logic. But you don't want, Stephen doesn't want to try and like head into that. I mean, it's the truth of it is I'd be really stuck if Logic suddenly stopped. If they just said, "Well, we're done. We're not going to do it anymore." It's like, well, what would I go to? I'd have to take several years off to sort of relearn the muscle memory of it.
I actually have an experience of watching you with Logic. I'd never seen such finesse. It was on the opening cue of, I believe it was Ice Age, and they wanted Beethoven. There was a kind of rewrite, a Beethoven-esque, or use an actual Beethoven moment, I just remember, and it didn't work, I don't think. And I was sitting there with some of the other executives and producers and filmmakers, and you said, I have another idea. And I watched you do something in Logic in, I would say, between 1 and 2 milliseconds. I mean, you rewrote a cue on the spot in front of the entire filmmaking team. And I thought, first of all, this is unbelievable music that you came up with. Secondly, I've never seen anybody able to manipulate Logic that fast, that seamlessly, and the cue was ridiculous and ends up in the movie. But I understand what you're saying about Logic. You are like Speed Racer.
Yeah. I mean, you get used to these things, and so I think it was unfair to try and push too much of that onto Stephen. So he was quite happy to just use a few sounds. We went through some things, picked some sounds for him to write, but in the end, he really mainly just stayed with piano.
Yeah.
And then yes, we would knock it up in front. In fact, even here, he would go in the other room, one of the other rooms I have here, when he was in LA, and he would go into the other room with Marcus, and he would Marcus would help him sketch some things out, and dealing with the tempo maps and stuff like that that's complicated stuff.
Two picture, in other words, he'd see people dancing,
yeah.
walking, talking, and he would try and
He'd try things, and then we'd get them into shape, and then we'd orchestrate them up a little bit, or we'd look at them and I'd go through it with him, and I'd say, look, how about if we take that and we just sort of we kind of spread out those chords a bit, things like that. It's just stuff that, and the reality is that I loved the work. I loved some of the stuff he was doing, but I knew that we would have difficulties because in earlier in my sort of 70 films, I would have done exactly that, and then hit it over again with the filmmakers going, "Why is it so busy? Why is it so busy?" And so I still do it to this day, and that's why I think I like animation. You can do it a bit more in that, but with live action, you have to be very careful. So I think it was a kind of it was one of those things. But the nicest thing Stephen's ever said to me is, he said, even if you completely change the cues, I still felt as if you'd heard me. And I thought,
Oh,
well,
that's
okay,
fabulous.
that's what I was probably supposed to be doing. That was the right thing to do then, because it wasn't about dismissing it in any way. It was about trying to find what was in his heart about what he was doing.
You're like a director in many ways. You really are. You're trying to get the actor to move towards something, but you want to know how they're going to get there. It's so great, John. Just hearing your process it's a masterclass. I think that we should at least touch on, because I'm asked about this a lot. I mean, I haven't told you that very recently I talked to a young composer and asked, well, was there a score that influenced you? And he said, I've listened to, I think, every John Powell score, and the first How to Train Your Dragon, I think, is perfect. I think it's actually, every note in it is perfect. In fact, it's the only soundtrack score I can listen to start to finish where I don't skip over any cues. I have to listen to all of them. And of course, Carol, who you know, who I work with, said, ask him about the live action How to Train Your Dragon, and ask him what it's like. Her question was, what is it like for you to come back to those themes? What it's like to do it live action? And you've worked on a lot. You actually said at the beginning of this that you couldn't have done this maybe before this moment in your career. She said, this is a really interesting question about the new How to Train Your Dragon. Ready? How do you think you may have changed as an artist and as a composer since you first scored the first one until this new one? It's a really hard question. You can pass.
Well, it is. It is interesting because I mean I remember over the years doing interviews and sort of talks and things like that, and you'd always get this question over the time. Well, what's the difference between doing animation and live action? And I would eventually I'd heard it so many times. You roll the eyes. I was even thinking of getting a T-shirt which said there's no difference or something like that.
Yeah.
It's like, and so I've been a little dismissive of that kind of question until right now. And right now, you see a composer who is in hell trying to figure out exactly that. Because it is hell. Because, we made that film, in 2009. And here I am with a film that Dean is making, which is beautifully the same, but different. And in the question of what do we do with this film is that there's no point in being different for difference sake. It's the same story. I have to try and achieve the same thing. So I'm struggling through all of it at the moment, trying to figure out, well, what did I do and why did I do it? And why is it different and what's working and what's not working? So it's just analysis hell at the moment of trying to figure that out, and then come to terms with those things, and be willing to change it where it needs to change, and be aware of what works and why it would work. And actually, the funny thing is that I'm so glad I'm doing this now after having done Wicked, because I learnt an awful lot from John, I think, about this process. He's a very wise guy.
I wonder if the fans of the animated films are going to be listening to every eighth note saying, wait, in this moment, and how do you get that out of your head? Because you have to score the film that's in front of you, not the score that, is remembered. But I know there's huge anticipation, me being one of them.
Well, another fun thing I got to do as well was do the music for the theme park as well over in Florida, which is there's this new Universal theme park called Epic, and there's the land of Burke, I think, the Isle of Burke, How to Train Your Dragon, the Isle of Burke, and it's
Oh,
kind of a whole world.
that's
And so
great.
so I kind of wanted to sort of just be careful that, in case it got a bit out of hand, because I just wanted to be a little bit involved, and Dean wanted me to be involved, and so I got involved, and they're absolutely lovely, and it was wonderful to do. And before we knew it, because I thought, well, I don't have time to sort of rewrite anything, but before I knew it, I had sessions booked where I basically had a band of these amazing kind of folk musicians, and we went in and I just took in all the tunes to all the movies, and we just did a couple of days of like jamming on the tunes, and I ended up with all this
Have you
material.
been?
No, I mean not yet. I mean it's still. I don't think it's still under construction. I mean, we see pictures and we talk over this kind of thing with them, but it's been very interesting to do, and the there are, with a bit of luck. I mean, as you wander this whole world, you really are going to be inside the movie, and music I think is going to be an interesting part of that
Oh,
everywhere you
it'll
go.
be huge.
Yeah,
So many
that's been
fans.
very interesting.
So many fans. John, thank you. I mean, I could go on for a long time about the scores, but I also just want to acknowledge the incredible creativity that you very modestly have just theme parks, operas, songs, scores, shorts. Incredible. Great, great output. Great, incredible expression. I appreciate all the work you do. I can't wait till we do something again together. And as I said at the beginning, I think just a short speech is really my recommendation. Just kind of a few thank yous, and then right off the stage. I hope you have that prepared because that is a great, great achievement. A great achievement. First of many. Can't wait to see part two. I thank you, sir.
Pleasure.
I wish you the best.
Thank you.
See ya. Talking to composers is basically my favorite activity in life, because I'm just amazed by the thoughtfulness of the great composers. And John Powell, I've seen literally, we have kind of come up together in a way. I met him first on Thin Red Line, where he was working with Hans, and now to see him at the peak of his powers is just fantastic. It's just fantastic. I love it. Did you enjoy the conversation about Wicked?
I did. That was great, Robert. And I, I've been listening to the soundtrack nonstop. And so I really wanted to hear John share more about, the process behind the scenes, but also his collaboration with director John M. Chu and Stephen Schwartz. So that was great.
I got to ask all about your favorite John Powell score.
You mean How to Train Your Dragon? Oh, I really can't wait for that one. So I am really glad he shared a little bit about it. And we're going to that theme park, right,
Ah,
Robert?
you're right. The How to Train Your Dragon theme park. That's amazing. Well, you have, I believe, a medley of John Powell themes to take us out. Is that something you want to share with the class?
Well, I've prepared a John Powell piano medley that I'd like to share with the class. And I hope you guys enjoy it. And we'll see you on the next episode.
See you next
Bye.
time. Cheers. Bye.